didn't take place when perhaps they should have were very controversial. The whole issue of humanitarian intervention, as it's called, was one of the great issues of that whole post-Cold War decade. There were many situations of this kind, varying degrees of seriousness that erupted, and generally the international response varied from the lamentable to the pathetic. And there was an extraordinary degree of controversy about each of these things, an extraordinary degree of disagreement, for a number of reasons. One of them, I think, was simply because there were no clear rules in the international rule book governing forceful interventions in situations of this kind. The UN Charter, when it was put together in 1945 after the horrors of the Second World War and the failure to prevent it, was concentrating on the issue of aggression between states, the traditional centuries-old problem of states waging aggressive war. It wasn't even thinking about the problems of internal catastrophe, civil conflict, sometimes governments themselves taking action against their own people. And the Charter was silent on this question, and in many ways was even worse than silent because it had some very explicit language in there referring to the principle of the sovereign equality of states and the non-interference of states in each other's internal affairs. Very explicit language in Article 2 of the Charter. Against that, there was only very slight references to the protection of individual human rights. A reference in general terms to that in the UN Charter, then of course some associated later documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenants, the Genocide Convention, in fact, as a separate standalone treaty. But inside the UN Charter itself, the Bible governing security of the world and how to respond to threats to that security, really pointed in the other direction. People just weren't focusing on the problem of, if you like, human security, as we've now come to describe it. They were focusing wholly on the issue of state security and protection of states from others. So one problem was the rules of silence. The second problem is that so many of the countries that now make up the body countries in the United Nations, 191 of them now as compared with just 50 when the Charter was first signed 60 years ago. So many of those states are new states that have been born out of the ashes of colonialism or born out of the fragmentation of the old Soviet Russian Empire. And they're very conscious of their own sovereignty. Sovereignty hard won is something that they're very reluctant to acknowledge any limitations on. So even when these issues were debated, and even against the horror of those situations like Rwanda where no intervention occurred, or Srebrenica where it was too little too late, many countries said, well, we don't want to support in any general way a principle of intervention because we value more highly the principle of state sovereignty and we're scared what will happen if we acknowledge limitations on that sovereignty and give the big guys in the world a free hand to do their thing, allegedly for noble moral causes, but they've had a long history of misusing that power in the past in Latin America and Asia and Africa and elsewhere. Who's to know they won't misuse it in the future? So you had that kind of reluctance. And you also had, through this period, disposition on the part of the big guys, in many of these cases, not to intervene when arguably they had the power, the muscle and the authority to do so. The classic of all such examples being really all the permanent five members of the UN, and in particular the United States, in the case of Rwanda. It's not that they didn't know that something bad was happening, they just blocked their ears and said, oh, it's just a tribal conflict, it'll blow over. A few people killing each other, but they've been doing that for centuries. We're not going to take it all that seriously. Why did they do that? Well, in the case of the US, domestic politics. They just didn't want to get involved because only a short time before there'd been the debacle of the intervention in Somalia. You may recall when 18 American Marines were gunned down, bodies, and a couple of them dragged through the streets, shown on global television, which led to an immediate American withdrawal from that particular humanitarian exercise and the determination not to be drawn in to this sort of conflict again if they could possibly help it in the future. So you had the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, President Clinton, for all their moral commitment to saving the world in all sorts of other ways, just didn't want to know about that particular problem. So you always, in these situations, have the problem of how nations see their self-interest and what they think they can do or what they think they can avoid doing, driven by domestic political consideration. For a whole variety of reasons, then it was just a real problem through the 90s. And every time that Kofi Annan tried to set alight a debate, as he did a couple of times in 99 and 2000, to try and get countries to focus on what went wrong, he himself felt very guilty about Rwanda because he'd been a senior official in the United Nations Peace Affairs section at the time, peacekeeping operations, and had some of the responsibility for the non-action that occurred. He was distressed about it, felt that the international community should be responding better, but couldn't get anyone to agree with him. And he tried to start this debate a couple of times in the General Assembly, and what you had was people just digging themselves into trenches, the mainly Western countries being at least rhetorically committed to the idea of intervention if catastrophic human rights situation arose, people's lives at risk on a big scale, and the developing countries, by and large, just taking the view that while there might be problems from time to time, it was a bigger problem to concede any limitations on the traditional scope of sovereignty. And it was a hopelessly bogged down situation. It was against that background that the commission that you heard about was appointed, which I was co-chair with my Algerian colleague, to a very distinguished group of international experienced people to try and come up with some principles for resolving this issue and ensuring that if another Rwanda came along, we'd be better equipped to respond, there would be some kind of consensus. We produced this report a couple of years ago, the end of 2001. Unfortunately, we produced that report just a few weeks after 9/11, and the whole international debate had shifted to a different set of preoccupations. People were no longer concerned with the rights and wrongs of intervening within countries to protect the citizens of that country. They were much more anxious to work out what to do by way of self-defense against terrorism, what to do against other countries constituting some kind of threat by their support for terrorists or possibly their possession of weapons of mass destruction or their willingness to supply such weapons to non-state terrorists. All those were the issues, as you're acutely aware, because they've been debated ever since 9/11. They were the issues that took over the international debate. And the argument about the rights and wrongs of humanitarian intervention rather disappeared. All of that has now changed a bit again in the last few months following the events in Iraq last year. I think we can all remember that the rationale that was advanced for going into Iraq by the coalition didn't really have very much to do with humanitarian intervention, protecting the Iraqi people from Saddam the tyrant. It had everything to do with the argument about connections with terrorism and the argument, of course, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, either in existence or in preparation, which he was going to threaten the West with. That was the way the argument was put. What's of course now happened in recent months, after the war in Iraq, is that those other rationales have rather disappeared. There's no weapons have been found, there's no programs have been found, there's no evidence ever been found of linkage between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda or other terrorists. A desperate search has been going on in Washington and London and Canberra to try and come up with a new rationale legitimising what went on in Iraq. And many people, particularly Tony Blair, have come up with this concept again of humanitarian intervention and said we were justified in going into Iraq because of the various horrors, the human rights horrors that were perpetrated by Saddam against his own people. So the issue is now back in public debate. People are focusing on it all over again. And one of the jobs that I'm presently doing, I'm on this new high-level panel that Kofi Annan has appointed to think about the whole future security arrangements for the UN, for the world. It's chaired by Kun Anand, a very famous, very distinguished Thai former Prime Minister. We're wrestling with these issues, and this issue of humanitarian intervention is now back centre front, the rules that should govern the use of force. So, the work that my commission did a couple of years ago, which disappeared from sight then, is now back on the international agenda. And let me just very briefly, in a couple of minutes, tell you what it is that we recommended and use that perhaps as a basis for discussion, or we can go off in any direction you like. What we said were several things. First of all, change the language of the debate. There shouldn't be a debate about the right to intervene, because that gets it wrong. That looks at it from the perspective of the big guys swaggering around, exercising their muscle. And it's no wonder it makes a lot of the little guys neurotic. Let's not talk about it in terms of the right to intervene. Let's talk about the issue rather as involving the question of whether or not there is a responsibility to protect. Not a right to intervene, but a responsibility to protect. Look at it, in other words, from the point of view of the victim, the women being raped, the kids. Let's think of it from that perspective. So that was the first thing. The second thing we did, we said, let's focus on this notion of sovereignty and explore in a little bit more detail what's involved this day and age in the concept of sovereignty. And what we suggested was that it was really very old-fashioned to think in terms of sovereignty just in terms of control, which is the way people have been thinking about state sovereignty for centuries. Control, exclusion of others from your own territory, non-interference in each other's territorial imperatives. We said, no, in the contemporary age, with the development of international human rights law and all the other constraints that are around on sovereign nations, we really need to think about sovereignty in a different way. Not sovereignty as control, but sovereignty as responsibility. And what we should start thinking of is that states and the governments that run states have a responsibility to their own people. But if they abdicate that responsibility, if they behave abominably towards their own people, or if they allow catastrophe to occur and are incapable of doing anything about it, then the responsibility in question, the responsibility to protect, shifts from the state itself to the wider international community. So this was an important contribution, I think, to the debate to get people thinking differently about sovereignty. Third thing we said is, let's think about this intervention issue not just in terms of coercive or military reaction to catastrophic circumstances, which is the way in which the right to intervene debate always was conducted. You think just in terms of reacting and intervening. We said no, if you approach it in terms of the idea of the responsibility to protect, that implies not just one kind of responsibility, to intervene, to react. It in fact implies a whole continuum of responsibilities. It requires a responsibility, first of all, to prevent, and that should be absolutely centre front in international policy, stopping these things happening in the first place. But if prevention fails, yes, responsibility to react and to intervene by non-military means if you can, but by military means if you have to. And then thirdly, it implies something else as well, and that's a responsibility to rebuild. You can't just go in, tear a place apart with the best possible motives, and then walk away again, leaving the situation festering and with the potential for ethnic and other grievances to rapidly re-establish themselves. That way, the whole problem starts all over. The responsibility to reconstruct, to rebuild, is a critical part of the international role. So that was an important conceptualisation. And the fourth thing we did was to identify a set of quite detailed criteria for when to go in, when to fight, when it's right to fight, if you like, if it does come to the need to react if prevention is broken down. So we addressed that and we said that there's a whole bunch of things that have to be satisfied. There has to be a threshold criterion identifying, it has to be a very, very serious kind of human rights violation involving loss of life or ethnic cleansing on a large scale, either actually occurring or about to occur. Secondly, it's got to involve the right intention, the right kind of motivation. The protection of people has to be a primary motive, whatever other motives there may be. Thirdly, there has to be a criterion of last resort. You don't go in militarily if there's other ways of a non-military kind of solving the problem. Fourthly, it has to be proportional, the means employed. so that you only apply the amount of military force that's strictly necessary to accomplish the objectives, because military force is always, everywhere, whenever it occurs, an ugly, horrifying business and should never be undertaken lightly and should never be undertaken unless you can do it in a way that's directly proportional to the nature of the harm that's involved. And fifthly, we identified the criterion, a very important one, of the balance of consequences. Can you be confident that the harm you're averting will not be overtaken by the harm that you actually do by setting in train a military operation? Very interesting question in the case of Iraq, of course, where the argument always has been that military intervention against Saddam is all very well and might be justified, if not what he's done in the last 10 years, certainly what he did in the 80s to the Kurds, gassing them, genocidal behaviour, what he did in the early 90s to the Shiites. Maybe you can use that as justification. But now, is it the case that the harm you'll be avoiding by getting rid of him will be less than the harm that will be done by giving a new cause to terrorists everywhere, a new argument about American imperialism and all the rest of it? Will the benefit to the Iraqis overall, as a result of all this, be greater than the benefit involved in getting rid of Saddam? A very important criterion, a very difficult one to apply in that situation. And the final issue, final criterion, the sixth, is right authority. Is it lawful as a matter of international law? And here you come down to the question, essentially, of the role of the Security Council, because that is the only authority that can make this kind of intervention lawful if it determines that it's a threat to security and appropriate for this action to occur. The big problem, of course, is what do you do if the Security Council doesn't act in a situation where your conscience shrieks out at you and says this is a case where such action should occur, like Rwanda. That was a difficult issue for the Commission, and we didn't have any easy way to resolve it. We said there's no real alternatives to the Security Council. What we've all got to try to do is to make the Security Council work better in accordance with all these criteria, not just ad hoc behaviour, and hope that in future the Security Council will respond more rationally, systematically, in a more principled way, and that if it doesn't, it'll be so deeply embarrassed it will lose its credibility, and that will be a political incentive for it to behave better. So they're the sort of issues that we were arguing for, and I think they do offer some kind of important help in addressing this issue of humanitarian intervention in the future. So that's one of the big contemporary issues in the global security debate. There are many others which we could, of course, discuss. There are problems with the rules governing the use of force elsewhere, the use of preemptive self-defence that the Americans have claimed as their legitimate right. There's issues about institutional capacity of the UN system and elsewhere. There's issues about the policy and the good sense or otherwise of the policy that we're employing to deal with terrorism, to deal with weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, to deal with the problem of failed and failing and overwhelmed states and all the problems that they generate. So there's plenty to keep those of us who worry about these things, those of us who study these things, occupied for some considerable time. Perhaps I've said more than enough to get a discussion going. So over to you. Can't really see anyone very easily against this light, so you have to wave your hand around a bit. Feel free to.
A couple of weeks ago we had the Foreign Minister from Timor as a Ramos Porter, and perhaps some of us were a bit surprised at just how restrained he was in terms of looking back at what perhaps had to happen in Timor before something really did happen. He was in some ways extremely peaceful in terms of saying we need to forget about the past and move on to the future. So I have two questions. One, as no longer a member representing the government, no longer foreign minister as you used to be, do you feel that in your capacity you were able to do more to move the bring about long-term change? And the second question is, one thing that he was quite critical of, and I'm not going to try and misrepresent him, or one thing that he said perhaps does need changing is that the Security Council, if we accept that the UN is very much the ultimate centre of international authority, perhaps, or certainly moral and political influence, that the current structure of the Security Council, with permanent members, which reflect basically the status quo of 1945, that time is long past and we need to look at a restructuring. So two questions, one about your position as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and now your current position and the Security Council.
He, as Foreign Minister, came in for a considerable amount of criticism over many years for our policy towards East Timor, including from Jose Ramos Horta very publicly. Though privately, he said to me on a number of occasions that he thought I was doing as well as anybody possibly could to advance the cause, and perfectly understood the constraints. He just had to understand that this was part of the rough and tumble of public presentation. The truth of the matter is, I think we were doing everything we could. Although it looks now as though independence was inevitable and the momentum was there, the truth of the matter is that before the financial meltdown in Asia in '97 and before the associated collapse of the Suharto administration and the complete turning upside down of Indonesian politics and the emergence of the rather eccentric Dr. Habibie, before all that series of events, nobody, including the East Timorese, however much they talked about it publicly, believed that independence was a realistic option. They didn't think Indonesia would ever be prepared to give it away, and they knew perfectly well that nobody in the international community would be prepared to take Indonesia on militarily to achieve that result. That remained the case, of course, I should say in brackets, that some people regard East Timor, when the military intervention did occur there, as being a case of humanitarian intervention, like Rwanda and all the others that should have happened. That wasn't so, because the Indonesian government actually agreed. It wasn't against the will of the government, it was something that they agreed, admittedly under a fair bit of international pressure. But the internationals would not have gone in there and bought a war with a country of over 200 million people. It just wouldn't have happened. And Jose Ramos Horta knew that, the East Timorese knew that. And what we were all plugging for was a situation of autonomy, maximum possible cultural, economic autonomy, freedom from the military presence of the Indonesian army with all their authoritarian misbehaviour, and the creation of an environment of that kind. And we were actually very close to getting that, and that's something I worked away at assiduously for most of the time that I was Foreign Minister, the whole time in fact. One of the things that mucked it up was Bill Clinton, when he came to Jakarta in '94, got very excited about all this and blurted it out in a public speech and said the one thing that has to happen is that the East Timorese people have to be given autonomy. And President Suharto immediately the next day said, well, that's something we might have been prepared to consider in the fullness of time, but we're not going to be dictated by the United States or anyone else, so autonomy is off the table. Which gives you an interesting little case study in sort of the counterproductiveness of even well-intentioned rhetorical behaviour, which a lot of people constantly urge politicians to do. Get out there and make a noise. Sometimes it can be very counterproductive. So the truth of the matter is, I don't want to sound too defensive about it, but we always said the invasion of East Timor by the Indonesians was absolutely indefensible, should never have happened, was without justification. But having happened, and there being zero chances we saw of that ever being reversed, the thing to do was to operate within those constraints, try and achieve maximum possible autonomy, maximum possible individual rights. And that was something that was perfectly well understood by Jose. And if he was standing here beside me today, I think he'd nod his head and say that was the situation as it appeared to be to all of us. And he actually went on ABC Australian radio and said at one stage, after I stopped being Foreign Minister, that we'd done the best possible job in all the circumstances. So there it is. There are limitations on what anybody, even the best intentioned people, can do in some of these jobs. So part of your question, I think, was, is there more freedom of action? Can you be more useful out there in the world of non-government organisations than you could be with all the constraints of government? But I don't think you can. I mean, there's nothing nothing more important than being in government and actually exercising some degree of executive power and some capacity to directly participate in these great debates in international circles. And you know, a non-government organisation like ours can be very, very close to the action. We spend a lot of time talking to presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers and working with the Security Council, permanent reps, the ambassadors, working with senior policy makers. We're very close to it. But it's not quite the same thing as being in the room where the actual decisions are made. And I wouldn't trade this job for my previous one. I wouldn't mind having the other one back. Not only the present government, but that's another story for another day. And there's no question I will go. That's it. In terms of your other question about the Security Council composition, I mean, this is something in an ideal world is absolutely, totally desirable, a complete shakeout, restructuring of the Security Council. The truth of the matter is it just does not represent the world of the 21st century. It represents the world as it was in 1945. But how can you claim to have a representative body when the guys with the real muscle, the real authority, the veto power, the permanent five, don't include an India, don't include an Indonesia in Asia, don't include a Nigeria or any other African country, don't include a Brazil or any other Latin American country. This is just not the world as it now is. But if you suggest to France and Britain, as I have, why don't you guys do the right thing, pool your seat in a common European seat and work out some rotating arrangement for the actual physical representation of that European seat in the permanent five, and thus break open the system in such a way as to make possible regional representation from the key players in Africa, the key players in Asia, key players in Latin America, and to actually produce a workably sized Security Council that is reflective of the world as it now is. If you say all that to these guys, they just laugh at you. They say, who are you kidding? We're not going to give anything away that's as important to our psyche and our sovereignty and our dignity as this. And I say to them in turn, well, that's all very well, guys, but this is going to be a diminishing asset because you may be able to keep on waving that flag now and be respected for it. But bit by bit, the Security Council, it was not seen as representative, it was not seen as in any way democratic, representing the aspirations of the wider international community. That Security Council is going to eventually go down the plug hole and you'll go down with it. You'll have a wonderful set of powers, but in a very diminished asset. A share that's not worth very much at all. But these are things for the longer term. It's because you can't change the UN Security Council system without the support of those countries that presently have the veto on all such decisions. You're stuck in a circle. So for all the talk, and we all talk our heads off about Security Council reform, and no doubt we'll keep on doing so, the truth of the matter is we're not going to be able to change that for the foreseeable future. What we've got to work away at doing is trying to resolve these questions in other ways. Through agreed guidelines, rules, better procedures, more institutional support, peacemaking, peacekeeping, reconstruction, and better policies being more sensibly applied. Getting the Security Council to act not in an ad hoc sort of power exercising way, but in a way that is rational and consistent from case to case, applying the sort of criteria I'm talking about. That's the task, and it's not an easy one. Anyway, it's a long answer, but there were two very provocative questions. Now, what about from someone who's not a teacher?
I'm Raquel. This is a little bit different because...
So can you put the mic a little bit closer to you?
All right. War today is cleaner than it was in 1945. Even 20 years ago, it's not the same as it was then. Like I said, it's cleaner. And I have to ask, the situation in Israel and that area of the Middle East has become a war completely based on religious prejudice. And although there are no warning signs for genocide, I'm not sure if either of the countries fit into the criteria set by your report. But is for what's going on, as it's quite obvious that neither of the countries can do it themselves.
Well, it's a good question. The situation as between Israel and Palestine and occupied territories is not really a situation of internal conflict of the kind that would create an argument for humanitarian intervention. It's for all practical purposes a classic conflict between state entities, albeit that one of those entities, Palestine, is not fully recognised as a sovereign state by more than a handful of countries, and in fact it is sort of occupied territory, but the issue is really a classic interstate kind of issue, and it's going to have to be resolved by classic interstate process, which is diplomacy, negotiation. I don't think anyone sees a military invasion by any third power as likely to accomplish anything other than further comprehensive misery, disaster. And there's also the problem, of course, that Israel has a rather formidable military arsenal of its own, including weapons of mass destruction, including nukes and so on. So for all practical purposes, I think you can rule out a military solution. I don't think the Arab countries are too keen on embarking on that course, which was hopelessly counterproductive when they did so in the past. So we are talking about a negotiated solution, and really, my organisation has written a lot about this, and we were much involved behind the scenes in some of that stuff that came out recently in the Geneva Accords, so-called the informal negotiated treaty that was reached between a group of previously high-positioned Israelis and Palestinians, demonstrating that agreement could be reached. The truth of the matter is this is not an impossible conflict to resolve. The two-state solution shrieks out at you as the only one that's appropriate and remotely consistent with Israel's own interest, quite apart from that of the Palestinians. And the overwhelming number in every opinion poll that's been taken for the last 10 years, even through all the horror of the suicide bombings and all the reaction to that, you still get over and over and again 70% majorities of both Israelis and Palestinians supporting a two-state solution with the border drawn roughly between two entities along 1967 lines and some resolution of the outstanding issues. That's where people want to go. The trouble is, it's a classic default of leadership on both sides. Palestinian leadership has never been very strong, very coherent, and has missed opportunities in the past, unquestionably, and continues to do so to resolve this. But the Israeli leadership has also, for the most part, not been helpful, to put it gently. And even on those occasions, like Camp David a few years ago, 2000, when Ehud Barak made some quite substantial concessions in that direction, it wasn't quite enough to get there. But it can be got there. It can be reached. The solution can be reached. But what it's going to need is a very serious exercise of international pressure and commitment, and in particular by the United States. You've got this quartet, the US, the EU, Russia, and the UN Secretariat, with the roadmap and all the rest of it. But the truth of the matter is that any kind of sequential, incremental process, like the whole Oslo process, which is premised on the idea of one step at a time, build confidence, build security, guarantee security, then move on to the next step. Any process like that is past its use-by date, because any process of that kind is hostage to the extremists on either side who can blow it up with a single bomb every time. You can't build confidence in an environment where extremists are battling it out, people who don't want a rational solution. You can only get there by having a blueprint, a fully negotiated settlement which addresses these issues of territorial boundaries, the future of Jerusalem, the problem of returning refugees, all that stuff. And there are ways to do it to solve all those problems which both sides ultimately can accept, which will be consistent with Israel maintaining its demographic identity as a Jewish state, which will be consistent with Israel continuing to be a democratic state, as it cannot be if it is determined to suppress its Arab inhabitants and not allow them to exercise full and effective rights. There is a way through this, but it will require absolute commitment by the key international players and by the United States in particular. And one of the most unhappy features of this whole current environment is the complete abdication of responsibility by the US for this. Just about everyone else in the world believes that if the US took this on, advanced such a blueprint, and really pressured the parties into negotiations, it would have the support of all the moderate Arab countries, have the support of the Europeans, have the support of the rest of the world, and have the support of the majority on the ground of Israelis and Palestinians. So I think that is the way forward. There's nothing inherent in the religious dimension of this particular conflict. There's no clash of civilizations or any of that other stuff that people periodically talk nonsense about going on here. There's just a very familiar kind of territorial dispute with claims of justice and injustice on both sides. It is capable of resolution. And I just wish they get on with it. Sorry, do you want another question? Please.
My opinion is slightly biased as a Jew, but I don't see how peace and resolution can come from Israel giving up land to the Palestinians, which is rightfully theirs, which they won countless times and which they fought for. And I believe this is a very religious war. I think it's based on religion, not territory, not land, because it's a constant dispute between Muslims and Jews that has...
Well, I don't accept that. I mean, the argument that Judea, Samaria is traditional Israel, it's been won legitimately by military occupation, only takes you so far, because if Israel occupies and continues to occupy all that land across to the Jordan River, claims it as its own, it's going to be only a very few number of years before, unless it expels the Arab inhabitants, the Palestinian inhabitants of that land, it's only going to be a very few years before Israel is a land with a totally Arab majority. And how are you going to maintain, how are Israelis going to maintain what it is that they fought for so long, the creation of an essentially Jewish state? They can't without a massive amount of suppression and the treatment of all those Arabs, Palestinians as second-class citizens. The only solution, and frankly the solution that is accepted, as I said, in every opinion poll that's ever been taken in the last 15 years, the only solution is a two-state solution which draws that line roughly where the 67 boundary was, which is wiggled about a bit to accommodate the reality of all those settlers, at least the ones around Jerusalem and the ones that are close to the 67 line, but gives away indefensible settlements that have been created elsewhere, gives the Palestinians some hope, some confidence in the future, it's their land too, and allows the two sides to get on and live in peace. There is no religious dimension to this that is not solvable by a proper negotiated approach to this, and I believe that passionately, and I'm very, very close to a lot of the people on both sides of this argument right throughout the Middle East. It's an issue that I've personally been involved in for many years. Religion's a distraction. It's an obstacle for those who are passionate about it and won't understand the necessity to make concessions and compromises. But it's not something that condemns this part of the world to endless conflict. It's not at all. There are other ways. Someone else?
Can I ask you a question? Sure. Given the criteria for intervention that you talked about earlier, firstly, how would the United States and British and alliances intervention in Iraq have stood up against that? Would the UN have therefore supported that intervention? And the second question comes out of the answer to that.
Okay. Well, if you run through those 6 criteria and apply them to Iraq last year, I think it's very hard to make the case for war. Begin with the just cause threshold. That is mass killing, ethnic cleansing of the country's own people. That did occur, as I said, in the 80s with the chemical attacks against the Kurds in Halabja. It did occur in the early 90s. The criteria were unquestionably satisfied then. But They haven't been satisfied the last 10 years. Saddam Hussein was behaving just like an ordinary common garden dictator of the kind, unfortunately, there's 30, 40 around the world. Human rights violations, yes, but not on the kind of scale that would justify an intervention. So the question becomes, can you dust off the shelf those violations a decade ago and use them as an excuse for military action now? If that was right, think of what you could do with Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, because he's behaving as a disgraceful violator of human rights at the moment, but he's not killing people on any kind of scale. But he did kill people, and his people killed people back in the 80s in Matabele land. People have forgotten one of those things, the world was just looking in a different direction. Scores of thousands of people were killed. And you could, under that same principle, if it works for Iraq, go in and say, okay, here we come, Mr. Mugabe, we're out to get you because we want to protect your own people from the villainy that you perpetrated in the past. So that's a hard one. Right intention. I think you can acquit Tony Blair on the good intention, the proper motives thing, because I think he always wanted to do it for protection of human rights and Iraqis, and he wasn't really all that thrilled to bits by the weapons of mass destruction argument, but went along with it because he thought that was the thing that would justify it. I think the story is a different one with the US. I don't think that was ever part of the motivation. God knows what the motivation of the Australian government was, apart from going along for the ride with Washington and earning, as someone said, some frequent fighter points along the way. But that's another story. The third question is, third criterion is last resort. Well, maybe you could say the only way to get rid of Saddam in a human rights violating sense was to change the regime by military force. Nothing else would do it. That's a possible argument the other way. Proportionality was the deaths of 3,500 Iraqi civilians, 10,000 military. We don't know the numbers because the coalition hasn't been counting them. Was that sufficient price to pay for stopping Saddam's capacity to persecute in the future? Maybe it was. The argument is finely balanced. The balance of consequences argument is a very difficult one to make, I think. It was at the time of the war, it's no easier now. Depends a lot on what actually happens in Iraq, how long the misery will continue, it's been generated by the war, whether Iraq will in fact become a democracy or a theocracy of some kind, whether or not the recruitment of new resources for the terrorist cause is being dramatically enhanced, as I suspect it has been by the war rather than the conquest, whether other authoritarian leaders in the region have been deterred from misbehaviour as a result of the American intervention. All of those things you can argue about, but it's very hard to make the case that the war was justified. And of course, on the last criterion, right authority, there's no question of Security Council endorsement, in fact the contrary. Explicit and clear majority, it wasn't just one state like Russia and Kosovo holding out, clear majority against it, feeling it wasn't justified. So very, very hard to make the case for going to war on that ground in Iraq. So the follow-up?
The follow-up is then, with these criteria, I thought the invasion or the intervention would fail on your criteria. Therefore, in reality, are they very particularly useful when, without the United States as the peacekeeper or the policeman of the world at the moment becoming involved, how far would other countries intervene in states without their sanction, without them supporting that action? For instance, in Liberia in the Civil War, the United Nations was about to intervene, but it wasn't until the United States sent submarines and showed some sign that they would support that intervention that the African coalition went in to help.
Well, I'm not sure the US role in Liberia was all that helpful. I mean, having people in ships offshore is about as useful as having an ashtray on a motorbike, I think, in terms of the actual necessity to have boots on the ground at the relevant time. And I think the Africans were prepared to go in anyway to do that without the US having committed themselves. Everyone hoped that the US would really be there to make the logistic support and military difference in the way the French had done in Côte d'Ivoire and the way the British had done in Sierra Leone. But the more general point is the real one. I mean, does any of this mean anything when so much is dependent on a single superpower to determine and shape the course of events? Well, I think you have to say yes, it does all mean something. I mean, the fact that these criteria were not satisfied, I believe, at the time of the Iraq War to justify going to war on humanitarian intervention grounds is not the end of the story. I mean, because the actual case that was made to the international community was not a case made on those criteria or on that ground at all, humanitarian intervention. People didn't talk about those things. They talked about in terms of the threat posed by weapons of mass destruction and the necessity or the legitimacy of acting in self-defense. So it's really a kind of pathological case. It's just an interesting case now because as those other rationales have drifted away, people are desperately looking for something to hang their hat on. But, you know, we can't run our affairs as though we're complete prisoners of the whims and ad hoc behaviour of the particular big guy. And I mean, the big guy itself is going to change depending on who's running the government. It's a very different approach to the United Nations from George Bush Jr. than it was even with his Republican father, George Bush Sr. It would be a very different approach again if there's a change of government, the Democrats take over. Even within the lifetime of this Bush administration, we've seen them going backwards and forwards to the UN as the political necessity is demanded, as they've realised in Iraq at the moment that they can't manage the political and constitutional transition in Iraq without the extra degree of legitimacy that UN involvement, serious involvement, will give. Won't manage that legitimacy either for Iraqis and certainly won't manage it internationally. They've gone back to the UN a couple of weeks ago, and now there's a UN mission there. So always in the American political psyche there's this tension between multilateralism, unilateralism, isolationism, imperialism. There's nothing inherent about the big guy just because he's so big not being part of the multilateral process. And I think the task for all the rest of us is to just over and over again make the point to the US that it is in the United States self-interest to be a cooperative multilateral player. Even the biggest guy in the world can't solve all the world's contemporary problems. You can't solve the problem of terrorism without the cooperation of lots of other countries. You can't dictate that cooperation, you've got to learn it. It's got to be given to you. You can't solve the problem of health epidemics like AIDS. You can't solve the problem of narcotics trafficking, international crime, without cooperation. And these are all things that deeply impact upon the national interests of the US. And smarter heads, I think, within the US, whom there are many, many people, I just don't happen to be concentrated in the present administration, smarter heads acknowledge that. And I think we'll see a shift of the pendulum back again as a result. But it's always going to be an issue. Just one final comment on this. I heard Bill Clinton not so long ago. I was on a platform with him, an extraordinary occasion high above the Hollywood Hills with a galaxy of movie stars in the audience. What the hell I was doing there was an interesting question. It was a fundraiser and he just turned up and there I was. And we were debating the issue of American power and the future of the world and security and so on. And at one stage Clinton said this, and I've never heard him saying it anywhere else, I've never seen it written down. He said, look, we've got a choice, the United States, as to whether we use the power that we have to go on trying to be top dog on the block, top dog on the global block for as long as we possibly can. That's choice number one. But the other choice we have, and the choice he said that I think we should make, is to choose to exercise that power to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the block. Now, that was a very interesting perception, a very nice way to put it, not only because it had the decency to acknowledge that American power was not something that was going to be with us for centuries, these things turn around, but also because it had that sense that in this global environment we occupy, you can only solve the world's problems through cooperative multilateral behaviour, not by the raw assertion of power. So I think life is a learning experience for everybody, even this administration in Washington. And I think we will see a reversion to a more cooperative way of addressing some of these issues, including the use of military force. So we're not condemned to the kind of single-handedness that you mentioned. Seem to be pretty intimidated sort of lot. Nobody brave, adventurous enough? Silly questions are okay. So don't worry. I won't laugh. Not to worry.
Can I ask you the question instead of going here?
Sure.
You brought up the issue in Zimbabwe.
Say again?
So you brought up Zimbabwe earlier on. Just a question from a completely different perspective. How critical do things need to be in developing countries for your organisation to want to get involved? In terms of, you were talking about genocide and so on, very extreme, obviously, events that create enormous amounts of misery. What about what Mugabe's actually done over the last 20 plus years in Zimbabwe, which has gradually got to a point where it's actually created 7 million starving people? And it is a tragedy in the making, but it's going to take some time for the rest of the world to notice, because Zimbabwe doesn't have anything to offer the rest of the world, such as oil or gold or extreme wealth.
Well, it's a shocking situation in Zimbabwe. My organisation has written a whole series of reports about it. We've been trying to mobilise an appropriate international response, including at two levels. One, targeted sanctions, financial and personal kind, directed against the regime. I've in fact been excluded from me and the entire British cabinet, me and someone else in my organisation. I think the only ones in this exalted status have been told we will be totally denied any visa should I ever go to any other place. Which I do, because I love Zimbabwe very much. It's a beautiful country, wonderful people. But it's shocking behaviour there, and my organisation is very much involved. We're in fact involved, the International Crisis Group, in about 40 different conflict or potential conflict areas right around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Latin America, as well as having advocacy offices in Brussels, London, Washington, New York, and Moscow. So we've got about more than 100, nearly 100 people working full-time in this organisation. We're supported by a lot of governments. What we do is field-based analytical research, policy, identification, recommendation, and then advocacy with governments to try and get them to implement those recommendations. And what we're mainly focused on is conflict prevention. We're not just dealing with situations where there's been a catastrophe and what the hell do you do about it. We're very, very into both long-term and the occasion of short-term conflict prevention and addressing the big issues like land reform. So we've got a big book-length report coming out in a few weeks or shortly thereafter time on the whole issue of land reform in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, trying to wrestle with what the rights and wrongs of the land reform issue are. Not to acknowledge that Mugabe has behaved decently on that issue, he hasn't. But there is a real issue, and it may be that some of the self-congratulation that the Brits and others have engaged in about the way in which they were prepared always to help resolve this issue, maybe some of that's a bit overstated. And we'll at least try and pick our way through and identify the rights and wrongs. So, I mean, I think it's absolutely critical to appreciate that there's an awful lot of problems around the world that fall short of genocidal level violence, or which require military solutions, or which enable military solutions. I mean, in most of these potential conflict or major human rights violating situations, I mean, a military solution is simply not going to help. And it's never easy to talk in terms of a military solution against big countries, because then you're buying yourself a much bigger war than the violence that you're trying to prevent. I mean, what do you do about Aceh? Do you attack Indonesia? What do you do about Chechnya? Do you attack Russia? What do you do about Xinjiang? Do you attack China? What do you do about Kashmir? Do you attack India? I mean, military solutions are not what we're talking about in many of these sorts of conflicts. It is diplomacy, it's exercising the leverage that you have. And our job, my job, is to find out how the levers can actually be pulled and pushed. What is it that will make a difference, and what kind of international support will work. So that's why, among other things, I'm spending a lot of time here in Bangkok talking to people about the situation next door in Myanmar, because that's an issue in which the ASEAN countries have really abdicated responsibility, I think, to push for democratic human rights respecting solution there. They've abdicated that responsibility in allowing Myanmar, Burma to join ASEAN in the first place without setting conditions on it, and they've abdicated it since by not being willing to put any systematic pressure. And, what we do is to try and shame people, if you like, or argue people into applying that pressure. And creating a more stable and peaceful environment, as well as one that's much better for the people suffering in the countries in question. So that's the sort of stuff we do, and if you'd like to look us up on the web, you'll get an awful lot of useful information for whatever it is you're writing about. Thank you, Ms. Evans, and on behalf of all the senior students today, I'd like to express our appreciation for the fascinating yet controversial topic of the right to intervene and the right of intervention. Clearly your experience as an Australian politician, but more so as a global diplomat now, help us reach some solutions. The examples you've given around the world are fascinating myself. Mr. Watts, for example, spent 4 years in the late 80s, early 90s working in Kenya. Kim, who asked before about Zimbabwe, was born in Zimbabwe. I worked for 4 years in Lesotho, 88 to 92, with Nelson Mandela's time in and out from there. So we've lived, we've worked, we've seen the shadow change come over Africa. Many of the students here today obviously are well aware of what goes on in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, but they're certainly aware of what is needed and what you've done and the efforts that you've done with your committee to try and get a resolution to the topic behind us on world peace and a culture of peace. So thank you very much on behalf of all at New International School Thailand. I'd like to call on Rachel Granite, to present, she hasn't been told, a small token of appreciation on behalf of this to you for giving up your afternoon and spending the time with us. Thank you.
Ladies, put so much